The call came in at 11:47 p.m., and Bridget Calhoun almost didn't answer it. She was still in her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and the cold November air that had followed her from the parking garage at Lakeview General. Her right knee ached the way it always did after a 12-hour shift, the old injury that never quite healed right. The one the military doctors had documented in a file 3 inches thick and then sent her home with a prescription and a handshake. She had been reaching for her kettle when the phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring twice, then she picked up. "Mrs. Calhoun?" The voice was flat, professional. "This is Corporal Giles, Westmount Regional Detachment. We need you to come down to the station." She asked what it was about. He said they'd explain in person. She asked if she was in trouble. He said they just needed to talk. It was the kind of answer that isn't an answer at all. Bridget had moved to Westmount 18 months earlier, after her discharge. She'd grown up outside Sudbury, spent 6 years as a combat medic with the Canadian Forces, did 2 rotations in Eastern Europe before her knee got bad enough that the forces decided she was more liability than asset. She didn't fight the decision. By that point, she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She'd retrained, got her RN, found a position in the cardiac ward at Lakeview General, and rented a 1-bedroom on Dunmore Street, with a window that looked out onto a parking lot and a neighbor who played guitar badly but with great enthusiasm every Sunday morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and she was slowly learning to live inside it. She drove to the station in her scrubs because she didn't think to change. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the kind of January cold that makes the air feel brittle, like it might crack. She kept both hands on the wheel. The officer at the front desk had her wait on a plastic chair under fluorescent lights. She sat there for 22 minutes, she counted. When the door finally opened, the man who came through it was not Corporal Giles. He was taller than she expected, with a broad face and the kind of expression that had probably been practiced in a mirror. His name tag read Sergeant Bastien Morel. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He looked at her the way some people look at things they've already decided about. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said, "thanks for coming in." "I didn't feel like I had much of a choice," she said. He smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We've received a complaint. From your neighbor." She waited. "Mr. Dufour says you've been making threats, that there was an altercation last Thursday." Bridget looked at him for a moment. "I knocked on his door at 7 in the evening and asked him to turn down his television. He told me to mind my own business. I went back to my apartment. He says it escalated. It didn't. He says you used aggressive language. I said, please, twice." Morel pulled out a notepad and clicked his pen. It was a gesture that was meant to seem official, but it read as performance. "Do you have anyone who can corroborate your account?" It was a 30-second conversation through a door. So no, so no. He wrote something down. She watched him write it and wondered what a man like this put in a notepad when nothing had happened. "Mrs. Calhoun, I want to make sure I have this right." He set the pen down and looked at her directly. "You're a nurse." "Yes." "At Lakeview General." "Yes." "And before that, you were." He glanced at the paper in front of him. "With the Canadian Forces, 6 years. Combat medic, and you were discharged." There was something in the way he said it, not a question, an implication. "Medically," she said. "Knee injury." "Right." He wrote that down too, she thought. He already knew that. He looked it up before she walked in. He is writing it down to make her feel like it matters in a way she can't quite name yet. "Is there anything else you want to ask me?" she said. "Or can I go home?" He looked up from the notepad. "We take noise complaints seriously here. I didn't make noise. I received noise. Mr. Dufour is a long-standing member of this community." She let that sit in the air between them for a moment. "And I'm not." He didn't answer. She picked up her coat. "I'm going to go home now, Sergeant Morel. If you have formal charges, you know where to find me. If you have more questions, I'd like a lawyer present." She got to the door before he said anything. "Mrs. Calhoun." His voice had a different texture now, quieter, less practiced. "People around here look out for each other. That's all I'm saying." She pushed the door open and walked out into the cold. She told herself it was nothing. That night she told herself, and the next morning over coffee she told herself again, and by the end of the week she had almost believed it. Then her supervisor called her into his office. His name was Dr. Emile Vachon. And he was the kind of administrator who had arrived at his position through a series of careful political maneuvers that he would never acknowledge out loud. He had a corner office with a view of the parking structure and a shelf full of plaques that all said variations of the same thing. He had always been polite to Bridget in the way that people are polite to someone they are not sure how to categorize. He sat behind his desk and did not invite her to sit. "There's been a concern raised," he said, "about your conduct on the ward." She sat down anyway. "What kind of concern?" He shifted in his chair. "A patient's family member filed a complaint. They felt you were abrupt, that you didn't take adequate time to explain a procedure." She thought back through her week, tried to find the moment he was describing. Which patient? He looked at the paper on his desk. "Room 412, last Tuesday." She knew room 412. Mr. Theriault, 68 years old, 3-vessel coronary disease, his wife in the chair by the window every single day. She had explained his post-procedural care for 11 minutes. She had written the time down because his wife had asked a lot of good questions, and she wanted to make sure she hadn't rushed. "I have documentation," Bridget said. "Time-stamped notes." Vacan folded his hands. "The complaint has already been forwarded to HR without speaking to me first. Standard protocol, lol. Dr. Vashon." She kept her voice even. "Someone filed a complaint and you moved it forward without asking me a single question." He looked at the window. "I'm asking now." She told him about the 11 minutes. She told him she could pull the chart. She told him she had treated Mr. Theriault's file with the same care she brought to every patient. Vashon nodded through all of it with the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. "I'm sure it'll be straightforward," he said. "HR will sort it out." She walked out of his office and stood in the hallway for a moment, her back against the wall, listening to the ordinary sounds of the ward, the beeping monitors, the squeak of a cartwheel, a patient's television somewhere down the corridor. She had treated hundreds of patients in this hospital. She had held hands through difficult diagnoses. She had stayed late because someone's daughter was crying in the hallway and needed 5 minutes with a human being. She had been, by every measure she knew how to apply, good at this. And yet here she was, standing in a hallway, wondering what she had walked into and why. The second call from the station came 3 days later. This time, it was Morel directly. He wanted her to come in again, he said. There had been a development. He didn't say what kind. She didn't go alone this time. She called Theodora Marchetti, a defense lawyer she'd met through a colleague at the hospital, and explained the situation in a 15-minute phone call that Theodora listened to without interrupting. When Bridget finished, Theodora said, "Don't say anything to anyone until I'm standing next to you." They walked into the station together. Morel was waiting in the same interview room. He looked at Theodora and something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, exactly, but a recalibration. The performance adjusted itself. "Miss Calhoun." He gestured to the chair. "We've had some additional information come to light." Theodora set her bag on the table. "What information?" "There was a noise incident 3 weeks ago. A disturbance in Miss Calhoun's building that resulted in a call to emergency services. We're looking at whether that's connected to the complaint we discussed earlier." Bridget had no memory of any such incident, she said so. "You weren't aware of any disturbance in your building?" "I was working the night shift 3 weeks ago. I wasn't home." Morel looked at his notepad. "The call came in at 11:15 p.m. I was at Lakeview General until midnight. I can show you the login records." He wrote something down. Theodora leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Morel, I'd like to understand what my client is actually being investigated for. Can you be specific?" He looked at her carefully. "We're not calling it an investigation at this stage. Then what stage is it? A fact-gathering exercise? Wonderful." Theodora's voice was completely flat. "Then we're done here. If you reach the investigation stage, please contact me directly. My card." She slid it across the table. They walked out into the late afternoon light. Bridget stood on the sidewalk and breathed. "He's fishing," Theodora said. "He doesn't have anything. But someone wants him to." "Why?" Theodora looked at her. "That's the question, isn't it?" She found out 6 days later, and it came from somewhere she hadn't thought to look. Her colleague on the cardiac ward, a nurse named Odette Biosoleil, who had worked at Lakeview General for 14 years and knew everything that happened within a 3-floor radius, pulled Bridget into the break room one Tuesday morning and closed the door. "I heard something," Odette said. About your building. Bridget waited. Your neighbor, Dufour. His brother-in-law is on the community board, and the chair of that board is... Odette paused. He's connected to Vachon. The pieces arrived in the wrong order, the way they sometimes do, and then they arranged themselves. Mr. Dufour had not filed a noise complaint because he was irritated. He had filed it because his brother-in-law had asked him to, and his brother-in-law had asked him to because someone needed a reason to flag Bridget, needed a file, a record, a paper trail that said she was difficult, that she had a history. Why? Bridget said. The word came out smaller than she intended. Odette sat down. There's a position opening. Senior clinical coordinator. Vachon's been grooming someone for it for 2 years. And then you transferred in, and in 6 months you had the best patient feedback scores on the ward. She sat with that for a moment. The absurdity of it, the pettiness of it, and underneath the absurdity, something harder and colder. They couldn't just not promote me, she said. They needed cause, Odette said quietly. In case you pushed back, she didn't sleep that night. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the ways a person could be made small without anyone raising their voice. The noise complaint that wasn't about noise, the patient complaint from a family she had served carefully. The sergeant with his notepad and his careful implications, the administrator with his folded hands. None of it was dramatic. That was the thing she kept coming back to. None of it was the kind of thing you could point to and say, here, this is the harm. This is the wound. It was all just friction, static, clouds on the horizon that hadn't become a storm yet. But she knew what happened when you ignored clouds. She got up at 3 in the morning and sat at her kitchen table with her documentation, time-stamped nursing notes, her CF service record, the login records from the night of the supposed disturbance, Odette's account of the board connection, which Odette had put in writing because she was that kind of person, quiet and steady and unafraid when it mattered. She started building a file. The person who changed everything was named Corporal Isabeau Fortin. She was 29 years old and had been with the Westmount Regional Detachment for 4 years. She was not Morel's friend. She was not, as far as Bridget could tell, anyone's political creature. She was just a person who did the job the way it was supposed to be done, which in certain environments made her something of an anomaly. Fortin had been present at the first interview, sitting at the back, silent, her expression giving nothing away. Bridget had barely registered her, but Fortin had registered everything. She reached out through Theodora, which was the careful and correct thing to do. She said she had reviewed the file. She said there were things in it that shouldn't be there, and she wanted to make sure someone knew. The 3 of them met at a coffee shop on Cartier Street on a Thursday afternoon. Outside, the January streets were gray and scraped clean. Inside, it smelled like espresso and the particular warmth of a room full of people minding their own business. Fortin set a folder on the table. The noise complaint was filed incorrectly, she said. The date on the internal report doesn't match the date Mr. Dufour originally called in. Someone changed it. Theodora was very still. Changed it, by 4 days, to a date when Miss Calhoun had no verifiable alibi. Fortin looked at Bridget, except that she did. She just didn't know she needed one yet. Who changed it? Bridget asked. Fortin looked at the table. That's being looked at now, above my pay grade. But I can tell you that the complaint against you was being used to build a case that didn't match the facts, and I can tell you that I documented that discrepancy the day I found it. Bridget looked at this young officer and thought about all the things it must have cost her to sit across this table, the calculations she must have made, the conversation she might have been advised not to have. Why? Bridget asked, not accusingly, just wanting to know. Fortin thought about it for a moment. My mother was a medic, she said. Reserve Force 30 years. She picked up her coffee. I just thought someone should say something. The internal review took 11 weeks. During those weeks, Bridget kept working. She showed up for her shifts and cared for her patients and answered questions when Theodora needed her to. She gave a formal statement. She submitted her documentation. She waited. The HR process at the hospital was quietly dropped when it became clear that the complaint had originated from a chain of communication that could be traced back to the community board. Dr. Vachon went on administrative leave in March, pending review. The chair of the community board resigned. Mr. Dufour's brother-in-law did not publicly acknowledge his role in any of it, but he did not need to. The paper trail was thorough, Sergeant Bastien Morel was reassigned to a desk role pending the outcome of a conduct review. None of it happened loudly. There was no press conference. No one stood at a podium and used the word accountability in front of microphones. The wheels of these things turn the way they turn, slowly, without ceremony, in rooms that most people will never see. But they turned. On the last Wednesday of March, Bridget drove to the coffee shop on Cartier Street and met Corporal Fortin for the second time. She brought 2 coffees and sat down across from her and didn't have a specific agenda. She just wanted to say something to another person's face. The position went to someone else, Bridget said. The clinical coordinator job. Fortin nodded. I'm okay with that, Bridget said. I want to be clear about that. That's not what this was about. What was it about? Bridget thought about the plastic chair under fluorescent lights, the notepad and the practiced expression. The 11 minutes she had spent with a patient's wife and then documented because she believed in documentation even when no one was watching. It was about the fact that someone looked at me and thought I could be moved, she said. That if they pushed enough, quietly enough, I'd disappear. Fortin turned her coffee cup in her hands. They didn't know you very well, she said. Bridget looked out the window at the March Street. The snow was going. The gray was lifting, slowly the way it always did eventually. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally the way most true things happen. No, she said. They didn't. She drove home with the window cracked, the cold air carrying the first hint of something that wasn't winter anymore. Her knee ached, the way it always did. She had learned not to wait for that to stop. Some things you carry. The question is only whether you carry them standing up. Bridget Calhoun had always known the answer to that.